The creators at Grounded believe that brewing great coffee shouldn't be a shot in the dark, and we couldn't agree more. Use the coupon code TheCoffeePodcast for 10% off Grounded at groundedcoffeebook.com. Our friends at Map It Forward are hosting 2 events we think you might be interested in: how to map a successful career as a barista, and how to map a successful career in business as a coffee roaster. Use the coupon code TheCoffeePodcast for 10% off your ticket. Remember, you can attend virtually. The following conversation is a living continuum that includes every link of the coffee value chain, from before the seed to after the cup. I'm Jesse Hartman, and this is the Coffee Podcast. Sourcing green coffee is a difficult topic to approach. There are so many angles to it, and it's dynamic in its very nature. Difficult topics to cover are things like coffee buying, green buying philosophy, green buying relationships, the importance of transparency, how to forecast, how to sample coffee, how to process your samples, and on and on. The good news for us here at the Coffee Podcast is that our guest on this topic knows a thing or two about sourcing green coffee. He's an expert on the topic and the author of a new book to our industry called Dear Coffee Buyer, a guide to sourcing green coffee. His name, Ryan Brown. And for a limited time, you can actually get 10% off this book, with details at the end of this episode. But for now, let's get to know Ryan just a bit.
I've been in coffee for about 19 years now, doing just like everything. The only thing that I quickly realized I should be far away from is wholesale, because I'm a horrible salesperson. But I have been a barista, I've been a roaster, I've even done digital product management. So essentially like working with web developers to sell subscriptions and sell coffee online. But ultimately, kind of the thing that I did the most of in my time in coffee was I was a green coffee buyer.
Sure,
and
yeah.
In 2005, Ritual Coffee opened, and we started as a wholesale account of Stumptown, but we had roasters right in our name. So it was always just like a matter of time before we would start roasting. And when we started roasting in 2006, we realized, kind of honestly, like after the fact, like, oh shoot, we actually need someone to go out there and buy green coffee.
Right on. It's sort of an afterthought.
You'd think it would go the other way around. I don't, it didn't though.
Right.
For me, these are like the halcyon days of, the third wave though also. And so there weren't just a ton of companies out there even roasting. I remember back then it was feasible that you could know every other third wave cafe that was in the United States. Like that was a reasonable thing to know just, off the top of your head. So anytime someone was like, oh, I'm going to Milwaukee, where should I get coffee? We'd be like, oh, absolutely, you need to go to Altera. Rest in peace. So anyway, when we started roasting, we realized we needed a green coffee buyer, and I was there, and I'd been selected to help with pushing the roasting out generally. I was someone who came from a background of, surprisingly, just a ton of cupping, because I worked at Peet's Coffee, which probably nobody listening right now is thinking Peet's Coffee is a place that I think of when I think of cupping a lot. But
Okay.
Surprisingly, back in the late 90s and early 2000s, if you worked at Peet's and you wanted to cup coffee just every day, you could do it. And I did that. I was really passionate about coffee quality and about tasting and about that sensory analysis. And the owner of Ritual, Eileen Hassey, she pushed me into buying, and miraculously it all worked out. And we did some really cool stuff over the next few years. After that, I was able to frustrate Aleko Chagunis, who was at the time the coffee buyer for Stumptown.
Yeah.
And it's now the founder and the head of Red Fox Coffee Merchants.
Right.
I frustrated him a few times because I was able to snag a few lots away from him before he was able to get to them. So he recruited me successfully, and I moved up to Portland, and I was a coffee buyer for Stumptown for all told about 2 years. During that time, I moved to Bogota, Colombia. I helped Beer Max Coffee and Caravella Coffee get their sourcing operation in Central America all sort of dialed in.
Nice. So do you know Alejandro?
Alejandro Cadena?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Oh, that's hilarious. He's on this series as well.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. I'm sure that he will have some just like excellent wisdom to share.
Yeah,
He,
that's an awesome coincidence.
He's an incredible coffee person. So I was in Bogota for about 4 months. Half of the time I was in Guatemala and Honduras and Nicaragua and El Salvador and even Costa Rica a little bit, and just trying to help them as they were trying to expand beyond just being a Colombian coffee exporter into being sort of this, at the time we were saying like a one-stop shop for Latin American coffees.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was wonderful. But after that, I wanted to get back to the States and quickly ended up finding myself with some friends starting Tonks Coffee. And
okay. Yeah.
Tonks Coffee was it, for those who don't remember it, I'll explain it. For those who remember it, thank you so much for remembering Tonks Coffee. Tonks Coffee was a coffee subscription service that was just a coffee subscription service. And unlike some of the other strictly subscription services at the time, we were sourcing and roasting our own coffee. In fact, our attempt at a mantra or motto was: we source, we roast, we ship, you brew.
Nice.
And
that's an awesome model. Yeah, I've not seen a lot of that. So you're right. You see a lot of this sort of sourcing from a roaster and then repackaging into some kind of box maybe, and then shipping. But you don't see too many of those. And it sounds like, what year do you think that was?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Tonks started in 2011, really in earnest in 2012. And I joined midway through 2012.
Very cool.
And it was a small number of us. And then Tonks we were acquired by Blue Bottle Coffee in 2014 because Blue Bottle was, had dialed in a lot of things, but they had not figured out how to really successfully operate their digital sort of strategy and plan and sell coffee online. And so we went over to Blue Bottle, and I was there for a couple of years. Then, as I mentioned, I am not currently employed in coffee, but because of that, over the last 2 years, I have been writing a book about coffee buying called Dear Coffee Buyer.
It's kind of under the wraps too, right? It's kind of a quiet project.
Yeah, a little bit. I like to think that's how I do everything, but it's been fun. It's something that Scott Rayo had pushed me to do for many years, kind of always just shrugged it off. But then for some reason, once I had actually left coffee, I felt like I can do this now. And I wrote an outline. And once I saw the outline, I got really excited. And it's a book that I wish had existed when I had started buying coffee, because it could have saved me just like a ton of headache and probably also avoided some mistakes that I made over that.
Sure. I'm looking forward to that. Y'all were gracious enough to share some excerpts from the book. I know it's not finished. I think it's extremely fascinating, and not necessarily trying to plug this, but I do think it's wonderful. What are you expecting a timeline? Like, what's the timeline look like for that, for the book?
Yeah, the book is done. It's being printed right now.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, so it's Dear Coffee Buyer, a guide to sourcing green coffee. If you go to dearcoffeebuyer.com, you can pre-order or buy the book, and it will be available in mid-April.
We'll make sure to definitely boast that out.
Thank you.
Cranked out, yeah. So Ryan, it sounds like you really kind of, I don't want to compare you to a ping pong, but I think like a ping pong ball, going across in every which direction in a match, and you really kind of jumped around in the coffee industry. Obviously, you'd mentioned that green coffee buying kind of became your main thing, to the point of Stumptown kind of swiping you out, going, "Hey, you're beating me. You're beating us at our own game. Like, now you need to join our team." It sounds like you totally knew what you were doing, and it was standing out. And it's an honor really to have you on the show to talk about green sourcing. I'm really excited to start diving into the details here.
That's generous. I'm honored to be on.
What are the major phases in buying green coffee?
It very much depends on the specific lot. So, and all I'm saying by that is that, and I'll describe kind of when you deeply invest in a specific relationship and you see something go from the iconic farm to cup, what that looks like. But there's also just, especially for larger roasters, there is very much the reality, and also for quite small roasters, there's the reality of, I need coffee now, and the importance of buying coffee that importers have on their offering sheets that are available domestically to you that you can have within days rather than potentially months.
So we'll call that spot coffee then.
Yeah, spot coffee is exactly what it's called. The most iconic version of coffee buying, for one, it's a sort of circuitous loop where you are always cupping coffee and you are always having an understanding of how certain regions and origins and producers are providing you and providing just like exceptional quality or just like characteristics that are interesting or intriguing or different.
Mm-hmm.
As you get to know those better, you make contact with suppliers and you explore the options available to you of those coffees. So that can be as simple as emailing up a supplier and asking for more information about how you can get more of this, to reaching out directly to a coffee producer in many cases. And of course also like potentially visiting that producer, at their coffee farm and getting to know it better and working closely with them. What I did a lot of over time was that I would find lots that were very interesting to me. I would visit producers, I would see what they were doing, and I would try to work with them to see how I could, like one of the big things, especially in the mid 2000s, was like, I would love to do day lot separations. I would love for you to make sure that we're keeping the different days of harvest separate, the different parts of the farm separated. If you're doing anything unique ever with the drying or the processing, keep those separate as well. Because one, as a new coffee buyer, you can just learn so much from tasting those separations from a farm.
Right.
But also it can help you to create the best version of that coffee that you can get. And also in many cases, like actually separating out the particular micro lot, really exceptional, just like should not be blended even with really great coffees.
Yeah.
Lots that are unique and providing those potentially to your customers. So, there's two ways to answer the major phases question. There's kind of like literally those pieces, like how do you create a relationship and then move forward with it? The other one is, what are the major phases in establishing a green coffee buying program? For the latter one, the reality is that often what happens is probably not that different than what happens in a ritual. A lot of coffee shops will at some point decide we want to roast, and they will pick a person to kind of lead that effort, and they'll probably buy a roasting machine or find a roasting machine that they can get access to. And then they'll realize, oh yeah, also we need to get green coffee. And initially they'll reach out domestically to importers. And especially compared to 10 years ago, but even 10 years ago, there's just like, there are really great coffees that you can buy from importers. And I want to make sure that it's not overlooked, that a huge part of being an exceptional green coffee buyer is having excellent relationships with the importers, like just as many importers as you can, and knowing which of them really supply you with what you need and what you're looking for, and who speak your, figurative language of quality and just like are on the same page with you. When they say something is an 88, you feel like it's, within a point of that. If they say something is an 82, you feel like you're within a point of that. What can be worrisome, and I've skipped over working with certain importers. It wasn't that I just generally felt like they were upselling me on everything. It was that they said some things were 82s that I felt were much better. They said some things were 90s that I thought weren't specialty coffee.
Right.
So, just like being on the same page is critical.
Yeah. And I suppose from a buying perspective, if they're saying something's an 82 that you feel like is a 85, 86, that's could benefit you technically, but it sounds like you're really going for sort of this transparency sort of thing with the importers. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah. And they might not talk in scores either. They, for some importers, this is the quality that meets our standards. And this is especially for more of the high-end importers who are offering a smaller selection. They're not necessarily a one-stop shop, but they have a small, but, not like, a nice selection of just like exceptional quality coffees. And you trust everything that they provide.
Gotcha.
So there's kind of like, once you get to know your importers, the biggest mistake that I see generally is this idea that everyone needs a dedicated coffee buyer, or they need someone to be traveling and buying coffee directly. And I would love to dispel that right now, because green coffee is important to you, and that does not also mean that you have to have a coffee buyer. Just as espresso might be important to you, but you don't have to build your own espresso machine, and coffee roasting might be important to you. You don't have to build your own roasting machine. You also can get exceptional coffee quality without necessarily having your own coffee buyer. So especially as you're, as smaller roasters are getting started at this, it's okay to largely outsource your green coffee needs to green coffee importers who you just really feel connected with in whatever ways.
Gotcha.
I come from a side of, at Ritual, I very much decided early on we were going to create relationships with producers. And it was partially because what I was tasting from importers at the time were largely not meeting what I wanted. I was really interested in finding producers in Central and South America and East Africa that had coffees that were just incredibly clean, incredible acidity and structure, ideally had very nice aromatic qualities that, would stand out on a table. And I made some mistakes on that. Like sometimes I would look at things that were aromatically very complex, and I overlooked the structure and usually not cleanliness, but sometimes I overlooked the structure, and there were consequences to that. Usually the coffee would go flat quite quickly.
When you say structured, are you speaking to the coffee specifically, or is that more of an infrastructure of the producer? You're talking about the structure of the coffee?
Yeah, I'm talking about essentially the acidity.
Got you.
The integrity of the acidity of the underlying coffee.
Got you. Just want to make sure I clarified that.
Mm-hmm. The next phase usually for a coffee buyer is we want to have direct relationships with some, not necessarily all, but maybe all. Like we want to have some direct relationships with at least some producers. And usually that phase is a matter of exploring the relationship that you have developed with certain coffees through certain importers, working closely with the importer to explain like, hey, we'd like to develop a relationship with this producer where we can visit them. And you will find that if you are, very transparent with importer, they will be incredibly helpful. And, as with all things, there are important business relationships that you're establishing. And my advice here is continuing to involve that importer in that relationship. They're very likely very close with that producer. And it's also incredibly convenient for you if you do end up buying coffee from that producer to to have that relationship with that importer who's probably also importing other coffee from that same producer. That all of those, like once you have logistical paths open, it's usually not worth trying to break them. I've found like even if you're going to save yourself 10 cents a pound or something,
right.
It's just you will end up wasting so much more money on coffee that takes way too long to arrive and ends up being compromised.
Yeah, and Ryan, to your point, even on that, I've spoken with people like Alejandro who speak to the fact that this infrastructure too for producers can be extremely helpful to them long term. The logistical structure that's already there, and these smaller roasters who are maybe they don't have the finances or they don't have the funds to actually commit to a producer in the way that an exporter could in situations where, say, there's a drought or something and there's no true contract power from a smaller roaster perspective. So there's those conversations of direct trade that I think, it's really romanticized.
The thing that's striking me about what you're saying is that you have to choose what it is that you want to really focus your time and energy on. And you can focus your time and energy on a lot of things, but when you do, you will become less great at each one of them. And for me as a coffee buyer, it was very much about finding really great coffees, getting them to my roastery as quickly as I could, and then telling the story of that coffee in a way that connected what the producer did and why it tastes the way it does.
I see.
And everything else to me was like essentially I when I was doing a good job, honestly, and when I was most successful, everything else was secondary, or even more importantly, like I was ignoring. So with regards to logistics and exporter relationships and things like that, so a couple things to note are like, and then in many other cases, the exporters were just very strong in areas, and really going deep into the logistics was not something that I knew I would be able to solve, especially even if I could get really, really, really good at it in a country. Like it can be a whole other game when you move just across the border. Right. So for me, it was focused on finding the great producers, and then, the coffees from those producers that just like really click, help them make more of that in whatever way you can. And then, just like get it to your roastery and present it in the right ways. And I found that when I tried to get fancy with how we might move the coffee, I paid for it every time. Like a very basic example of this is one of my early trips to Guatemala. I met with, it's funny now because when at the time I was just like, I was so sure I was right, but I visited a bunch of very large exporters, and I was explaining to them that I wanted day lot samples. You just have to imagine, like, I'm trying to buy dozens of bags of coffee, not dozens of containers. They're used to selling dozens of containers. And
right.
And like, here comes this like essentially kid, probably in a hoodie, and they're all in suits. And I'm trying to explain, like, you're showing me regional blends. I want to see your day lots. Like, I want to see like separations of this. And, also like, you haven't even caught up to me on that. But also, when we find a coffee, I want to export it in vacuum packaging. And right. I can tell you what ended up happening from that, Jesse. It was like, so that was in probably February of 2007. And I received that coffee in September and October of 2007. So, I mean, just like, it took way too long.
Right.
Coffee that I received had already kind of been compromised. And I learned so much from that. The funny thing about that is that there was a cupper in one of those exporters who overheard me, and he knew this exporter can't do what you want, but he worked with someone else, Luis Pedro Zelaya, who runs Del Cafe in Antigua, Guatemala.
Okay.
And he was like, that guy can do it for you. And so I ended up being contacted by Luis Pedro, who was like, I know you're trying to find these really special coffees, and I think I can do that for you. And so in a way, it ended up paying off, but not directly from those relationships.
I see. Yeah, it's funny because the question seems pretty innocent and simple to say, what are the phases of buying green? It's not that simple, right? It's nuanced and very, I mean, you've written an entire book on it. So there's so many really interesting stories. I think too here, what I'm seeing a lot of, we talked a little bit about transparency, quality of the bean, and then this idea of separation and things like day lots, things that you were pursuing then, I suppose, in 2007, things that are really kind of, I feel now in today's industry in the specialty realm, very common, right? To have micro lots and all these things. So, but then you're saying was not very common at all, right?
It wasn't. No, not at all. It was an uphill battle every time. To be very clear too, I did not pioneer, like the day lot thing had existed for years. I credit George Howell's efforts. Essentially, Cup of Excellence was an attempt to create day lot. And George, as a small buyer, wanted to really be getting special coffees. And I feel like he influenced this whole movement. And Jeff at Intelligentsia and Peter at Counterculture and Aleco at Stumptown absolutely took it and pushed it to a whole other level. I was very much looking at what they were doing and saying, yeah, this is the right way.
So, we've talked a little bit about sort of the hands that the coffee touches before it reaches somebody like a green buyer. We talked a little bit about, using the resources that there are available to you before you even have a green buyer. I think companies like importers, and you said that's actually a nice way to start depending on the size of your company, right? So we're really tackling a lot of really interesting points here because, again, I think it's really with most topics, and we talk a lot of things on the podcast, but with most topics, it's really easy to simplify everything, oversimplify it, and talk about it very flatly. And green buying is not a flat thing. There's so many angles you can come from. There's sort of even philosophies, right, that you can have in your buying. And I would like to talk about that just a little bit. You mentioned philosophy of green bean purchasing, and what are you getting at, and why should our listeners think about their philosophy if they're looking to buy some green coffee?
Yeah, the thing I often see, and this is very common when you're getting started at something, is it's just simple, right? Like I just want really great coffee. I just want the best coffee. And the problem is that's not an easy thing to rally around. And it ends up meaning something very different for different roasters. And also they end up worrying about things that maybe they shouldn't worry about, like whether or not their competitor has the same coffee or similar producer, or, like that's like a very common one. Is just like, why does my competitor have the same coffee as me? And if you don't know the answer to that question, then it probably says more about your own buying than their buying, unless there was some understanding that you were buying all of a producer's coffee. And I'm not going to go deep into this, but generally speaking, you probably wouldn't allow any one of your customers to buy all of your coffees. I don't know why you would expect that your supplier would sell you all of theirs. The ability to create a philosophy around what it is that we offer to our customers is something that is like a mission statement for a company. It's something that, by the way, you probably also haven't written one of those based on the several coffee companies I've worked at. And you very likely, if you don't have a mission statement for your for your whole roasting company, you probably also don't have an idea of what it is that is like the philosophical glue that decides whether or not we buy a coffee.
Right.
And when you really examine the way that different roasters have bought coffee, you realize that there are several different approaches. And I've had the opportunity to establish two separate from scratch buying programs, and I did them each differently. And neither of them was better. Both of them were more suited for the specific of that company. So in the case of Ritual, it was all about, clean, washed coffees from Central and South America and East Africa. And everything that we did and that we talked about on our bags, in our training, in the way that we brewed coffee, in the way that we roasted coffee, was meant to reflect back to this idea that we were highlighting exceptional producers. And, like a small thing that at the time was, as a lot of the stuff is, like at the time was like quite special, but now is run of the mill. At the time, all coffee bags would look something like this. I'll pick like a really famous farm. So Guatemala, Finca El Injerto, and that was like the coffee bag. And what we were saying was, okay, so this is from Arturo Aguirre, and it's Arturo Aguirre's Finca El Injerto, and then Guatemala can be the smallest thing. To me, it seemed silly that the country was such a prominent thing just because it was to our customers. Mm-hmm. But I also felt like we could change that over time, and we could make it more about the producer than it was about the country.
As far as what you see on the bag, for sure, and that still is a pretty prominent thing that roasters focus on is the region the coffee comes from. So that is a unique, and to your point on philosophy, like highlighting the producer themselves. It was, I'm sure, as you said, unique then, certainly carrying forward these days, but you do see that focus on region still.
On the other side at Tonks was a coffee subscription business, but what we talked about internally was we were really a publishing business. So what was important to us was that with each coffee, you felt like you were getting something unique and different, totally different than before and totally different than what you'd get the next time. And there was accompanying, essentially like an article from Tony Konechny, who is the namesake of Tonks, and just an incredible writer who had this ability to, at the same time, be speaking to the coffee expert who has worked in coffee for, 15 years, and also the person who is, just getting into coffee, mm-hmm. And is, amazingly, there are people out there who do not work in coffee; they just drink it, And, and he just at once could speak to both of those people so perfectly. And just like everything about the coffee and the packaging and the baggage, like there's a, different image with each one. And the packaging was specific to the fact that it was a subscription box, and just like all of that stuff, like it all came together. And the coffee, the offering philosophy, like what I was buying was being very much informed by the entire brand. So there is no like, this is the perfect way to approach a philosophy. There's just many different ways. One other example, this is not me, but my friend Kevin Bolin owns St. Frank Coffee, and he's begun roasting. But even before he started, he has sort of a mission in how he sources coffees. And he really believes in developing relationships with producers who might not have exceptional quality, but have good quality and a lot of potential. And
I see.
He has he has religious motivations for establishing specific relationships with producers. And that's just that's a whole other approach to it. But he understands what that is. And he's balancing that also with just some producers who he's known for a long time who hit it out of the park as well. But there's many other ways to do this. Coffee Collective, at least back in the mid 2000s, I remember that they had relationships with 5 producers, which I remember just being so jealous of, because I was just imagining what if I had to buy 5 coffees a year? Just I would have all the other time to do other things.
Right.
And so they had relationships with 5 producers, and I imagine that's changed over time. Maybe not. I don't know for sure. But it was 1 in Kenya, 1 in Guatemala, maybe 1 in Costa Rica, Colombia, et cetera. But and it's that was their whole menu, and they knew that. And as a result, they talked about we're able to focus very strongly on having meaningful relationships with fewer people, and that's true. If you can buy 2 or 3 times as much from a producer, you will become a more meaningful customer to them. And they're that much more likely to listen to what it is that you're interested in doing.
We've covered a lot of ground on the topic of green sourcing, and I'm happy to say that the conversation with Ryan Brown is not over. A continuation of this conversation can be listened to on our next episode. Also, be sure to check out Ryan's book at dearcoffeebuyer.com, where you can purchase his book and learn all there is to know on the topic. And for a limited time, use the discount code TheCoffeePodcast for 10% off your book purchase. If you're having trouble with the discount code, reach out to us at hello@thecoffeepodcast.org. The Coffee Podcast is produced by me, Jesse Hartman. Music is by Michael Parallax. You can find his music at michaelparallax.com. Thanks for tuning in. And as always, an